Hi, everybody. Welcome to our third installment of Ballpark Figures. I'm super excited for tonight's guest. I'm also very happy that you're here. We are 2 days, everyone, 2 days from opening day in a season that we didn't even think was going to start, right? Um, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Shakeia, freelance writer, SABR Award winner, pace of play agnostic. And tonight's guest is Marc Normandin. Marc currently writes on baseball's labor issues and more at marcnormandin.com. His writing has also appeared at Defector, Baseball Prospectus, SB Nation, and other publications. He also writes a regular newsletter on retro video games. Hey, Marc, how are you?
Doing all right. How's everyone doing tonight?
Well, we are very excited to be here. We are very excited that you're here as our labor guest this evening to talk about all of the things that happened this offseason. But first, is there anything that you would like to say about the offseason? Do you have a comment, a summary of any kind? Did it go well?
Oh, it was very tiring for my beat specifically, I guess. Yeah, some things went well and some things I immediately, once the CBA was signed, one of the first things I kind of thought was, well, 2027 is going to be pretty busy too. So,
Oh, yeah. Okay. With that said, very simply, what do people mean when talking about labor, and what is the role of unions?
uh, so labor is the workers. They're the ones doing the work. They're the ones doing the labor. They're the ones creating the value for whatever it is that is being done. So, in the case of baseball, the pretty easy way to look at it is you can have baseball without owners, but you can't really have baseball without people playing baseball, can you? And I know we like to think sometimes that there's a lot of baseball players who make a lot of money to do what they're doing, and maybe they shouldn't make that kind of money. That's an argument you especially see during labor disputes like the one that we just had. But they're still the workers, and society's been kind of designed around this idea that athletes deserve to make this much money. So they're still workers. They're still labor.
Yeah.
They're still performing labor. They just get a huge amount of money for it.
Okay. So one of the things that came up a lot this offseason was the luxury tax. In your 2019 piece on Deadspin titled MLB's Luxury Tax Became a Salary Cap Because of Decades of Failures, you wrote, to understand how the luxury tax went from a compromise to something very like the salary cap it was supposed to prevent, we have to go back to the 1980s and 1990s. We hear a lot about luxury tax, what teams are willing to spend, what teams aren't. What is the competitive balance tax? And can you tell us about the shift that occurred in the 80s and 90s and how that's felt today?
So there's a strike in 1985. It was a very short one. The players didn't even necessarily want to strike as kind of a unified unit. There was some kind of internal fighting between veteran players and the younger players. And because of that, even though the players quickly won this 2-day strike because the owners gave them almost everything that they wanted, the one thing the players did concede on was they made it take one more year to reach arbitration eligibility. And this is a thing that was allowed to happen because the players weren't as unified, and the players who had already been paid kind of didn't understand why the players who hadn't been paid were concerned about this. That helped the 3 years of collusion happen in the 80s, because suddenly there was just a flood of pre-arbitration inexpensive players that allowed teams to avoid free agents, which is the thing that was happening very much from the 2016 CBA onward. It's very much like the moment, if you have to pick one moment, it's the one that kind of led to today, especially since the reaction to being caught colluding was for the league to demand again and again they wanted a salary cap, and eventually, to avoid another 1994 situation, the players are actually the ones who proposed a luxury tax setup with a competitive balance tax, which I feel like you have to be a lawyer to actually say it. I feel dirty even saying it that way instead of just luxury tax. But that was meant to be, okay, if you go so far beyond what everyone else is doing, like you have to pay a penalty on those dollars above that, which, you know, I don't love it. You can see that there would be problems with it. They've gotten so severe that it essentially is a cap in all but name. And this winter's negotiations very much tried to push it even more to be a cap.
Okay. So I am not exactly the most knowledgeable person about the new CBA. What positives are there to take away from this? But then on the other side, what are the negatives?
I think the players had a few goals, but I think the biggest goals the players had were they wanted to get younger and less experienced players paid more, and they wanted to deal with the competition issues in baseball that had, you can't even really call it tanking in baseball, because it is very much like teams that just straight up aren't trying. They're not trying to win because they will make more money if they don't try, which seems odd, but the whole economic system of MLB at this point is you don't have to do any. I mean, look at what Oakland's doing. You know,
Right.
You don't have to try to get paid. The Forbes numbers that came out last week, I think the 3 or 4 of the most profitable teams were, I mean, they were nowhere close to the playoffs, and they spent very little. So those were kind of the two goals of the players. I don't think they succeeded fully on the competitive side of things. A lot of that was like, okay, let's try these more indirect approaches, and I think that's stuff they're going to revisit in 2027. I mean, I kind of hope it's stuff they revisit in 2027. But as far as getting young players paid, they did get they didn't get the increase to the minimum that they originally asked for, but it's still a huge number in terms of pure dollars and percentage increase. It gets to a pretty good place by the end of the CBA too. The bonus system, I actually like it more. The one that MLB originally rejected, that was like for 30 players. I like this one more because it spreads it around to more players.
Okay.
You know, there's a lot of things like that. There's cutting the options down to a max 5 per season. There are players who were optioned like 12 times last year. And I don't think people realize necessarily what that means for your salary. You know, if you're in the majors for 2 weeks before they send you down again, you're not really making the league minimum in the majors, which is a considerable number. But if you're making the prorated version of, like, I did 2 weeks of work in the majors and got the 2 weeks rate for $570,000, but then you spend most of your time in the minors on the 40-man roster on a prorated, you know, 45,000, it's a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to stop those sorts of things is significant. I do think there's still work to be done there, but that was considering what little the players had to use as leverage.
Okay.
They did well in that regard. But the other goal, it's kind of a we'll see, and like they'll probably have to go back to that.
So you mentioned the younger players, and I can partially see your shirt, and I believe it says unionize the minors.
Sure does. It's a Gen 1 tipping
Shout out to
pitches.
tipping pitches.
This is the one they tried not to get sued for.
How likely is it for the minor leagues to unionize, and what are its largest obstacles?
Well, you know, a lot of folks wonder or get very angry about the fact that they're not in the union now, like already.
Mm-hmm.
That is not, it's just not a possibility for some, that ship has sailed reasons, and also just some like legal reasons. The last time the players even approached it was in 1994, and the league essentially refused to bargain on anything until they dropped the issue. And since it's not something they have to bargain on, the player, even though the players are doing like the morally correct thing, it is not a legally required thing. So the league was not in the wrong to say, like, we're not going to talk to you about anything. So there's kind of nowhere to go there. And you see people get very upset about that sometimes. It's unfortunate, but when they were originally setting what the bargaining unit was in the 60s, it did not include the minor league players, which was a choice. And you can argue about whether it was the correct choice. You know, it was hard enough to form this first union in sports and get this first collective bargaining agreement in sports to begin with. So that, there's debates to be had about that, but the thing that the minor leaguers should do is form their own union. They should try to sync it up so that their agreements are up at the same time as the MLBPA's, because then they can combine their leverage together to get what they want. But otherwise, they have their own concerns and their own issues, and kind of, I mean, you see the way the PA bargains sometimes now, like bargains away the future of players who might not even ever be union members. It seems like they kind of forget in a hurry where they came from in some regards.
Yeah.
So like let them, the minor leaguers should handle their own issues. And a few years back, I was writing about, there were a lot of major challenges. There's kind of different ways to do it. You have to figure out the scope of the bargaining unit. You're going to have different unions for each level. Are you going to have different unions for each league within levels? It's kind of hard to do one union all the way across, but I mean, you're looking at what Starbucks workers are doing, for instance, where they're just popping up union after union after union. Maybe that will be one giant Starbucks union at some point. Maybe it'll be a bunch of individual ones, but once one bargaining unit figures it out, I think a lot of dominoes start to fall, to cliche it up a little.
Is there something that fans can do to sort of support minor leaguers through the obstacles of attempting to unionize if they decided to do that?
Yeah, I think MLB really doesn't I don't think they care so much about bad press when it comes to major league players, because they can point and say, Bryce Harper makes $40 million a year. Like, why are you complaining? But when someone points out what a minor league player makes, or that they're still making poverty level wages after getting a 50% raise in their salary, or that they are essentially paying to play baseball because the hotels make playing in home games more expensive than playing in road games, things like that. They don't really have a defense for that other than going like, here's some money, here's some concessions, please stop talking about this. So I do think that's an area where if fans make sure to discuss and share and kind of disseminate information that groups like Advocates for Minor Leaguers are putting out, or they're sharing on social media stories that minor leaguers are telling about their time in the minors, I do think that gets to MLB, not in their hearts or anything, but I think it scares them a little more. The public realizing the conditions of the minors, because minor leaguers were talking about it, is a big part of why things have improved even the way they have in the past 3-4 years, I'd say.
Social media has had a massive impact, when you say, I mean, especially on the housing. Just over the last few years, I've seen a lot of people, myself included, talking about, poverty wages and, not being able to afford a place to live. And then over the last couple of days, I've seen a couple minor leaguers posting their new places, and they're not gigantic, but they're nice living places. And I think that, having a nice place to live will impact the way they play, because, comfort translates to performance for most of us. Would you agree there, though, that the changing in housing and social media has kind of definitely had a massive effect on that?
Absolutely. I think it makes it easier. I remember Ty Kelly, who's one of the founders of Advocates for Minor Leaguers, and he's a former Mets player and former minor leaguer. He's a vegetarian, and he posted photos of like the vegetarian options, from the Mets minor league facilities. And it was basically just like, here's your ham sandwich, but we took the ham, or here's your bologna sandwich, but we took the bologna out. So now there's just a very sad piece of lettuce and a old tomato, and they wouldn't let him bring salads that he spent his own money on and like made, because like the team had provided a meal that day, and that was the meal that you were supposed to eat. I think just being able to see that and have that direct connection where someone goes, here's photographic evidence of this thing that is kind of like food but isn't quite food. Stuff like that blows up. It also lets journalists see this stuff kind of firsthand. And then they can write about it and kind of bring it to even more people. So social media is a good starting point. because Ty Kelly isn't necessarily going to, and other players aren't necessarily going to like fire off a newsletter or a blog post on their own, like they'll put it on social and then people pick it up. But the way that kind of spreads, it's not even really something that would have happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The ecosystem of all this is just very, very different. And I think it's part of the reason MLB doesn't have a plan for any of this. I mean, Rob Manfred even said, I don't know how much Rob Manfred's telling the truth about anything ever, but Manfred pointed out that he had no idea that social media would have such a big impact during the lockout. So either he was trying to pretend he was complimenting the players, or they had genuinely never considered that like they could tweet about it.
Yeah. It's kind of silly to not think about, right? Kind of in the same vein here, but what would you say is the best response to people who reduce the labor dispute in baseball to millionaires versus billionaires?
Ooh, well, the vast majority of them are not millionaires. And that's really like the start of it. Is it's kind of, again, like Bryce Harper and Mike Trout. Yeah, like they're set for life and their grandkids are set for life and their grandkids. But most players, the average career length in MLB is something like 5 years. So even before you consider that a lot of players are having their service time manipulated so that they're under control for 7 years, they don't even get to the point where they get to be a free agent, where they get that big contract. And teams are cutting these kind of, guys who would have stayed on rosters years ago, who are enter arbitration eligibility, they get cut. Fewer and fewer, the money keeps getting bigger and bigger, but fewer and fewer players have access to that money that would allow them to say they're a millionaire. Leaving aside even that you get a player to come up from the minors who was there for, let's say, 5 of the 6 years of their original team control contract for the minors, they've been living on poverty level wages for years. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure they have lots of debt, or they haven't fixed their car, they haven't replaced their car, their first big league contracts, like part of the money goes to that's just like getting back to zero. So it's not like they get $570,000, last year or whatever, and then it's like, cool, I'm good for a while. Then you have the guys getting optioned a million times. They never even really made the league minimum. So yeah, there's just that it's billionaires versus, not millionaires. I don't have like a smart way to say that. It's just
I try to explain it as there are minor leaguers who make less than some of us normal, regular, non-athletic people. Like, like we are not having to, live in groups in a tiny apartment, or, I have a friend who is a minor leaguer. I used to work with him in undergrad, and he constantly talks about, having to pay just so much money out of his own pocket to play, just to live, just to eat, just to survive. And he talked about like renting Airbnbs, and like I can't imagine, you can't, like, well, now it's different, but before now, you can't have a comfortable place to live. You don't know where you're gonna live. You don't know where you're gonna, how many times you might have to move, and then you're not making any money for the inconvenience. It's really unfair. And, like you said, these advocates for minor league groups are very, very helpful. And I believe they accept donations. Someone put in the comments that we can donate to them. So a question about the international components of the labor battle in baseball. What are they? And in what ways would a potential international draft alter these components?
Well, I am anti-draft, just generally speaking. It's all about reducing negotiating power and limiting spending and reducing the take home that these players can get. And, someone would like to say, maybe as a counterpoint, that, well, teams like the Pirates can't compete if the Yankees can just buy up everybody. But I mean, the reality of the situation is the Yankees hate spending money and the Pirates don't try anyway. So it's kind of like a made up issue. as far as the international thing goes, it's just kind of extending that reach that they already, they've pretty much dominated the domestic market. They've reduced the draft size. They've reduced the bonus pools by putting caps on them. They would just like to do the same thing with the international market. They like to say it's about cleaning up kind of the issues that they've created, that they already have rules that they could just enforce and, solve these problems. Like, you're not supposed to sign 13-year-olds. So maybe get the teams in trouble when they do sign 13-year-olds. Like,
Right.
problem solved, I don't know what they think it's gonna, if any like shady practices with trainers, they're still gonna try and get them draft ready. They're still gonna owe them a part of their bonus. Like, the draft doesn't fix any of that kind of stuff. It's just about limiting control and limiting the players who would be in the minors. If there's a draft, you can't sign infinite minor leaguers for every roster spot that you have, Oh, excuse me, sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, it's just, you already got players who are in a tough position with the when they put the caps on international spending, and we spend a lot of time talking about players from the Dominican or Central America, because MLB really kind of like jumped into those places and took advantage of the economic situation in a lot of those countries to be an attractive, appealing place where they could kind of exert their influence and power. But it even hampers like free agents coming over from Japan. The whole nature of the agreement with Japanese players coming over from NPB, MLB at some point was just like, well, we're bigger than you, and this is how things are going to be now because we're tired of spending money. And it's like, well, what do you do about that? So I'm glad that things were pushed off until July. The players, even leaving aside the problems with the international draft, giving up draft pick compensation for the qualifying offers. There's like a dozen players that impacts each year, and the way it impacts them is not necessarily that significant. We're talking about getting rid of something that's kind of annoying for a dozen guys a year versus something that is going to make like life in careers worse for hundreds of players a year. I hope the union does the right thing on that and just pushes that off again.
Okay. One of the things that frustrates me and probably some other people watching is there seems to be no way to incentivize spending. There seems to be no way to say, go and attempt to win, go and compete. Is that true? Is there no way? Is there no way that because I feel like players want to win. They don't want to be, stuck on a team who's constantly sending guys out once the team gets good. Like, is there a way to stop that? Can we put a Band-Aid on that?
The best way I can think of, I guess in terms of potentially realistic solutions, is a salary floor. Now, MLB tried to attach, they tried to reduce the CBT to 180 million if they did $100 million salary floor. But just because they did that once doesn't mean that's how it'll be forever. They didn't want to raise the minimum. They didn't want to do the draft bonus. If the players stick behind that long enough, I think they could get a salary floor without instituting either a cap or something that basically is a cap. But that's one of those things they need to wait until 2027 for, to just, again, go like, we have 5 more years of evidence that the solutions we tried are not working. But that's really the biggest one for me is that salary floor, because again, look at what the A's are doing. They were re-added to the revenue sharing recipients. They won 86 games last year. The postseason expanded by 2 teams. They already had a very low payroll. They have this new revenue source, and what they did was they were like, well, we can pocket that if we trade all of these guys, and our gate will go down, but it won't matter because these new revenue sources will more than make up for it, and we'll raise the prices anyway to maximize what we get from the tickets we do sell. If there was a floor with legitimate penalties, they couldn't do that so easily. It wouldn't be such an easy calculus for teams. Okay. It's very fascinating to me that the luxury tax threshold is designed to punish teams that are trying too hard. And there is nothing stopping a team from not trying at all. If they don't care about winning, simply not winning is not punishment, you know?
Mm-hmm. I mean, but also, what's the point? What is the point if you don't try to win? I'm still stuck on that. Like, I don't know about anybody else. I like to win. I like to be great, and it's been really affecting how I root for teams and whether I show up. And I feel like that's happening with a lot of, MLB fans. They're checking out. They're going to see other things. They're branching out to, women's basketball. Shout out to women's basketball. Phenomenal Final Four. But I'm going to jump into some questions we got submitted. And to those of you watching, if you want to start putting your questions in the chat, I see a couple already. I will read them to Marc, and he will continue to educate us. The first one is from Brian Hall. He says he was interested in using AI ML to demonstrate whether or not players are underpaid based on either race or whether they are foreign born. And so he wanted to know, in your opinion, not only baseball, but other sports, which sports do you suspect there may be a pay bias?
Ooh, I do not know enough about the intricacies of all other leagues for that, but I can tell you MLB likely has one, partially because of what we were talking about before, which is, I mean, there are already bonus limitations in place if you are not from the United States. Like, right, there are bonus limitations in place if you are from the United States, but they're much less strict at the top. If that they have larger bonuses for domestic prospects to a point, and there are caps in place, but there's like wiggle room and things there. Internationally, it's much more strict. So you're already starting from a place where it's like, well, okay, so we're not paying this Dominican-born player as much as we would if he was like a white baseball player from Nebraska or whatever, who went to college or high school. I don't know how well that would play out over time in terms of once they get to the majors, but like was said earlier, most guys aren't getting to the point where they're getting that big payday anyway. So if there's this discrepancy and bias up front, that might be it. You might always have that.
This question is from Howie. This is kind of funny. Have you ever known Manfred to root for a team, watch a game for pure fun, or praise a player or play anything to signal to us that he loves our game?
I mean, it's not in his programming, so it's not really his fault. But yeah, Manfred is fascinating because I feel a lot of ways about Bud Selig, and all of them are negative. But at least he did like baseball, and he was good at tricking people into feeling he probably liked baseball more than he even did. But like, Rob can't sell it at all. It's completely unbelievable to me that he has ever watched a game while not on the clock,
I don't understand how he can even have the job he does and not, like, I don't know. Well, I'm not a business person. I don't know. Keith is asking, when will the Mlbpa spread its solidarity over the minor leagues?
Like I mentioned before, they can't really directly unionize them, but they certainly could assist in the efforts in terms of being there for support in the same way they could be there for any business. The thing I'll probably get yelled at for saying is, I don't know how much. I think the players who are in like the executive board and the like the bargaining unit and all that, and I think the Mlbpa is like an institution. The executive, like Tony Clark and all them. I do think they really care about that stuff. I do not know how much the broader membership cares about it, not just for the minor leagues, but other unions. That stuff is tough. If I they can't even necessarily help themselves all the time. They accepted this contract. They voted yes on this contract that they just got, even though the board voted against it. And that makes me a little nervous about how much solidarity is like hiding in there for other people.
Yeah.
If they don't even necessarily have it like for their own good. So I don't know. I'm hoping that they can at least figure something out for the minors. There's some nascent organizing going on in the minors, and this isn't like some inside info or anything. But just like look at the way people rally behind like advocates for minor leaguers or whatever, and they've tasted success. And I think they're going to keep pushing, and I hope they keep pushing. So when it comes to it, whenever that is, I hope that the PA is really there to help with more than just like some statements or something.
Does the new CBA allow players to make deals with gaming companies? Are we risking Black Sox 2.0 with baseball's new love affair with gambling?
I haven't seen the full text of the CBA, so some of that stuff has just been like trickle out. I know that's more just like, from what I've seen, it's kind of like, hey, MLB is going to make money off of gambling and NFTs. We want some of that money. Like that seems to be the extent of it. I don't know if there's like individual partnerships in a worrying way. Things are probably I feel like they're pretty vetted at this point, because they don't want that. I saw people saying today, that what do they call it? The thing to show, to pick pitches between the catcher and the pitcher. What's that new technology they're introducing?
Someone's going to drop it in the chat. Watch.
What's the new technology? PitchCom. Yeah, PitchCom. I already saw people saying like, oh, that's probably like a gambling thing. It just makes it much more secure, which reassures everyone involved in the gambling side of things. So yeah, I don't know if they can do kind of individual stuff like that soon, but I don't know, maybe it's worth it if it makes Pete Rose mad.
Way to stick that in there on the end.
I have a brand,
The new CBA was achieved after a highly contentious negotiation. Do you think the owners or players achieved more of their objectives, i.e. who won, doesn't improve or worsen competitive balance? I feel like we kind of talked about that a little bit, but.
Yeah, I think there's some more specifics though. It's weird. I think the players won more, even though some of that is kind of like, right now it's kind of, I don't know, not ethereal, but certainly not tangible yet. The players needed to stop the slide they had been in for the last decade, 2 decades, depending on when you want to start counting from, but especially in the last decade. And if they had given up a lot of ground and made no real gains in the CBA, especially when they were standing so firm, 2027 was going to be a bloodbath. Like, the union wouldn't be over yet, but you could see like, well, if they can't get it together now with all of this going on and people behind them and things so obviously stacked against them, are they ever going to be able to do it? So I do think, even though there's things to be worked on, and it's not like my favorite CBA I've ever seen in my life, I think the players won as much as you could. The owners lost in the sense that they did not crush the union. I mean, that was their goal. They wanted to crush the union, and their bluffs were called enough. I mean, it was the last day to have a 162 game season every day for like 2 weeks or whatever,
Yeah.
I still think the players gave up a little early. Gave up is strong, but but the owners certainly did not get what they wanted. They put very regressive things in their proposals for a reason, and they didn't get them. And there were a lot of things that were in the proposals that were not reported that made them even worse for the players. But you have to be like a labor wonk or extreme, like really into this stuff to understand why it was a bad idea, which I think is why it wasn't like reported stuff.
Which leads me to a question though, Mark. How, like, the reporting on the negotiations, it ended strong. At least it felt like, the reporting started to stabilize and get better. but there felt like for a while, you know, the reporting was a little questionable. Maybe we could use some stronger, labor reporting everywhere. So then every few years, we're not having to ask you, 60 questions in an hour. But like, in what ways can labor reporting change? In what ways has labor reporting sort of evolved with social media?
Oh, I mean, I wrote a piece for fair.org about the problems with the reporting going on a few weeks before things got sorted. So that was good. It's bad out there, and it got better, like you said. I think you have some cases where like some ESPN writers, for instance, they are, never mind like annoying a source by being too aggressive or like correctly reading the room, I should say, correctly reading the information they have been given. ESPN gets mad if you too clearly like pick one side or the other,
Okay.
So that makes it tough for like, I don't know, I don't really want to name names, but it makes it tough for people who do know better, but like aren't
Yeah.
allowed to show that they know better. And I do think there was some real pushback in that from outlets like that, from people at outlets like that, which was good to see that they finally just like threw down and were like, okay, listen, this is the owner's problem, and like laid it all out. But I do agree that early on, as much as someone like Ken Rosenthal improved over time, kind of early on he was a little too wishy-washy, like trying to explain why both sides brought it here without it being like an explicit both sides.
Mm-hmm.
I think not just with Rosenthal, but like a lot of people improved that over time. And I do think part of it was seeing feedback, seeing more and more of what was happening, and reading the people who were out there. I used to get criticized and yelled at a lot more like 4 years ago when I really started complaining about the CBA and the state of labor. And that's changed less and less. I mean, it's changed so that I am yelled at less and less. And I do think it's because you see more people like picking up and learning on these things,
Mm-hmm.
and not like because they're all reading me or something. My Patreon would have way more subscribers if that were true.
But you should, everyone. You should be reading Marc.
That's
Plug
true.
yourself, Marc.
But you do have people who know these things, and just like with the minor league conditions, I think if you have media members read these things and then realize like, oh, I'm doing this the wrong way, I'm presenting this the wrong way, I need to learn more about these things, they'll fix it.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone. All the newspapers have their like local guy who yells at things, and that they're not going to change no matter how many. That's their whole thing, is not changing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can get some of the national writers to change, and I do think there's kind of a younger, more internet based group that's growing in numbers and size, that made this feel more even in total, the coverage, than I maybe expected it if you had asked me a few years ago what things were going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
I think what needs to keep moving, what it needs to like progress that for the next time to make it even more clear, is more of these people need to know what actually happens in a labor fight, in a lockout, in labor negotiations. So we don't stop hearing about how long the two sides were meeting or whatever, when the whole point, like even if they thought they both agreed that this was the best thing they had ever seen, is going to take 10 minutes. Because you come in there with a piece of paper and you read what's on the piece of paper, and you hand them the piece of paper, and then you go off and meet to do the actual like thinking.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need an army of reporters like breathlessly being like, oh, we went from that tent to that tent. That was 10 minutes. Things are getting better. The last one was 8. Like, that's not helpful. And understanding like why things might have moved at a glacial pace, and that it's not because like the players are just saying no like to everything or whatever. There might be a reason, and understanding that like what's out there is not everything that's out there, but that's probably more on like people who are like aggregating or writing about reporting of others. There's just so much more, and if you take the time to learn the ins and outs of it, you will understand better what goes into all of these negotiations, and then your readers will understand better and then everyone has done their job.
This question's from Mary. In what way, if any, is MLB's seeming disinterest in promoting players on a national level connected to the owner's extension of control over the players? And does MLB need nationally known players to succeed as a league?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you've got owners in there who don't care about the product, they don't care about promoting the product, so they're not going to care about. I feel dirty saying product there, but if they don't care about the players who are actually putting on the performances because they don't care about winning, they just care about profits. Yeah, I could see that being tied together.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Does baseball need national stars? I think maybe it needs national stories. I don't know if it needs national stars.
Okay, you want to elaborate on that though?
Well, I think of like the low point that MLB was at before the '98 home run chase, for instance. I think even more important than it being Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, because Sosa was like compared to McGwire not being in World Series teams, those famous A's teams. He was like a comparative unknown on a national scale, but I do think he was quickly embraced when he was part of this larger, intriguing story that was able to grip everybody. I think that's probably where you go. I think part of what makes like Shohei Ohtani so fascinating is the story and existence of a Shohei Ohtani, in the first place. He's obviously amazing to watch, but so is Mike Trout. And I don't think people, the story of Mike Trout is he is very good at baseball. He is very good at what he does. And I don't know if that's going to grab people on a national level the same way as like, look at this guy. He's doing something you've never seen before. Yeah. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So if you get those stories, I think that matters more.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's successful regionally. It doesn't. I hate to boil things down to like the money they're making, but they make absurd amounts of money, and I don't know if that will last forever. And there are definitely problems with like the average age of a viewer because none of us are going to live forever. But I think being interesting in a story level. That's kind of where I
like that. Baseball needs national stories as opposed to stars because it is a game that thrives on the narrative. I mean, look, I write about it all the time. Bill is asking, what message is being sent to Cubs fans? The Ricketts claim biblical losses, trade the core of the 16 team, then investigate buying the Chelsea soccer team. Bill's not happy with the Ricketts. I mean, but he's right though. Where do they fit in? What message are they sending to their fans with their maneuvering or non-maneuvering, shall we say?
I'm sure they would defend it with like, oh, but that's different money. We only spend Cubs money on the Cubs. We spend Ricketts money on, the soccer team. And now that soccer team will only have soccer team money spent on it. This is how having billions of dollars works. Yeah, I mean, there's no good way to spin it other than like them not responding to it or saying something like that. Just some kind of business jargon. They don't care. The Cubs won their World Series. They had their competitive core. I'm sure they'd be happy to get back to it and brag about how good their team is, like to other rich people. But I don't know. That's if it takes 10 years again, they can always point to 2016. They were in charge in 2016. And now they've got the soccer team to pay attention to.
That soccer thing is a mess and off topic, so I won't talk about it. But Gary wants to know, does the CBA increase the chance that MLB expands to 32 teams in the near future?
I have said for, I've been writing for so long. I have said for quite some time now that we won't see expansion until all of the like nearly unsolvable stadium problems are solved. Because MLB likes to have these other places in their back pocket so that Oakland can, the A's can negotiate their new park wherever. Because if Oakland won't give them the space or the park or the money that they want, they need to say, oh, we can go to Las Vegas, we can go to Montreal, we can do any of that stuff. I'm sure part of the reason the Rays are other than their plan being like completely unworkable. Part of the reason the whole kibosh was put on that was like, we need Montreal for things. You can't do this. You know, we need to make people think we would move a team there forever. So I think MLB has the room for expansion, and the expansion fees, I think they said, would be $2.1 billion or something. So the other owners would not be opposed to more expansion teams, because then they get, you know, 150 million or whatever a piece, which is pretty good. Pretty good money for doing nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I just don't think they do it until they solve the current stadium issues. And with the amount of time it's taken to solve Oakland, then, you know, some other Oakland and like Tampa, some other team might have a problem that needs solving by the end of that too. The last waves of expansion were kind of, they were a response to the collusion from the 80s, because the amount of money that the teams were going to owe the PA and the players was something like, in today's dollars, it was like $650 million or something.
Wow.
So they were basically like, hey, what if we just create a whole bunch of new jobs for you guys? Like, would that be cool if we use that money to like do that? And, you know, it worked, and they expanded. And so I don't, you know, the PA dropped the grievance that was going to be worth maybe $500 million this time around. So I don't think we'll get anything like that kind of spurring it all on ahead of the expansion, ahead of solving the ballpark issues either.
Was it a good thing that they dropped that lawsuit? I've wondered that myself, so I'm glad you mentioned it.
I'm not thrilled about it.
Okay.
I think it's part of the reason the executive board voted no was because it was like a significant, if MLB wanted them to drop that grievance, it's because they think they might lose it. There's no reason to do it otherwise, you know. Look at the way they handle like service time grievances. You know, they've got that locked down. They don't mind they'll go to grievances over those all day. But the two that the PA had out on revenue sharing and the season length in 2020, to solve those for their side, they would need to open their books, and the lie is worth more to them than being exonerated would. Also, opening the books wouldn't exonerate them, but they want to keep that info locked away, you know. So that's why they wanted them to drop it, because they know it's like, well, the only chance we have of maybe winning it is if we open the books and cook them a little, but they didn't even want to do that. So yeah, I'm not happy about that.
Okay. I mean, I thought that dropping the lawsuit was not necessarily in the best interest of the players, but I wasn't too sure. But, you know, and I thought about the owners and transparency. Brandon has two questions. I'll let you answer the first one before I ask the second one. What are some of the things Mlbpa should be doing, saying, or signaling towards between now and 2027?
They should probably wait a little bit, just for like fatigue purposes. Because I think a lot of fatigue in like the media and with fans with like constant labor issues kind of led them to the place where they retreated in the late 90s, which led to you know, 2016 and all that. But they should let things play out a little bit so that they have kind of tangible things to point to. So when you see, hey, the Pirates still aren't convinced that they need to do anything or try or put this guy in their opening day roster. Hey, there's still service time manipulation happening. Hey, this solution actually made things worse. Keeping up with that stuff and maybe not tackling it as it's happening, but kind of just keep a log for a little bit. And then after you have an off season or two, start making noise kind of in preparation for 2027. But they do need to make sure, I think they need to make sure more of the players are on board this time by the end. As I said, the general player populace kind of voting against the executive board makes me nervous.
So you think there should be some strategizing amongst the PA, maybe some, you know, community building amongst the PA so that they present a more united front in 2027. That's what you're saying, right? Like they need to work
Yeah.
on that first.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
kind of, they've got like internal things to solve before they present their
Okay.
message kind of outwardly. I do have a little bit of hope for that though, because I mean, time marches on, players are going to retire, new players are going to come in. New players coming into the league now, they just went through all this stuff with the minors, fighting for housing and fighting for more pay and fighting for better working conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're like more seasoned fighters, essentially, and probably like maybe we'll have a stronger base next time around.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have any other questions? We are gonna wrap up soon if no one does. I'll give them a second here while you drink your water. This was really informative for me, Mark, because like I said, I knew next to nothing other than, I come from a pro-labor family. Um, and you kind of, you always side with the labor, you side with the work. And we do have a question that I can get my computer to scroll back for here. Here we are. So minor league wages, aren't the players wedged by the owner's ability to reduce the number of jobs and the seemingly endless supply of players? There are currently 48 partner league teams with, Scott believes, 22-man rosters.
Yeah, that was, I do think that was a big part of the disaffiliation in the first place, that first round. It was essentially like, listen, you can have some more pay, but it's going to come at a cost. And it could be your job next time, and thankfully that doesn't seem to have worked, because then everyone turned around and said, hey, the housing situation sucks, fix it. And that's not to say MLB doesn't have power over them, but I think you have players who realize things are already terrible. They can't get much worse. And that's kind of a powerful place to be in, as much as it sounds like a dreadful place to be in terms of, organizing or fighting back, because there's a nothing to lose component to that. And as far as cutting jobs further, the current professional baseball agreement is a 10-year deal. So, no one who's in the minors now is going to be on their original contract if they're still in the minors 10 years from now. I think players are in a pretty good position to fight and not have that kind of hanging over them, that they might, that their jobs might be reduced, because like this is it. This is what the minor leagues look like for a while. They will probably try to shrink them again, but we'll see how the legislation at removing like the antitrust exemption goes. We'll see how the Sen versus MLB lawsuit, the class action suit, goes. MLB might be in a much different environment by the time the next one comes around.
Can you talk a little bit about the antitrust exemption? I think that is a huge deal. If you could give us a little background, explain it, and also tell us what, getting rid of it would mean.
Oh, it's intimidating going back 100 years in front of SABR people.
Maybe don't go back so far. Just give us a little summary.
Well, it started 100 years ago. So that's all I'll say. And it kind of allowed MLB to disaffiliate with no real challenge in before the 2021 season. Essentially, they're allowed to do this monopolistic behavior because they have an exemption on being punished for it. Which is kind of what, there's a couple of teams that were disaffiliated with a lawsuit out right now with an antitrust suit against them. I don't have very high hopes for it, because if you put it in front of the Supreme Court, they might say, well, yeah, it is antitrust behavior, but they're allowed. They have an exemption. So, like, what do you want us to do? Which is basically how SCOTUS has handled this for decades, and I think in the 60s, I can't remember exactly which one, but they were like, oh yeah, this doesn't really apply anymore, but we can't get rid of it because there's retroactivity when the Supreme Court removes something, when they make a decision to remove something like an antitrust exemption. It would open MLB up to just like innumerable lawsuits. of all their past behaviors, of which there are many, because they've been able to operate as if the rules don't apply to them for a century now. So that's why if there's legislation through Congress to remove the antitrust exemption, I will feel much better about future antitrust suits, because then they will actually be like, hey, the rules do apply to you. But we'll see. We'll see if the antitrust exemption goes through. I do think the biggest modern example of them kind of using that to do what they want was coming into minor league baseball, forcing the president to resign after using him to convince the team owners that it was okay to disaffiliate, and then just sawing off part of minor league baseball and writing the new agreement by themselves in what's supposed to be a negotiation.
Right. Do you have any resources for us, places that we should check out, read? Obviously, your Patreon, you want to tell us where we can find that? Just, for educational purposes, we want to be prepared for 2027 too.
Well, yeah, my Patreon is patreon.com/Marc Normandin. And then I write a newsletter 8 or 9 times a month, very often on labor stuff. That's at marcnormandin.com. So I would say if you just want to do some reading, and I'm sure a lot of people have read this stuff, Lords of the Realm is a must, just for some real background for how far back all this behavior goes, and you really start to be able to connect the dots. It's a real all of this has happened before. Names and places change sometimes. Jerry Reinsdorf's still around, huh? John Pesa's The Game is great for kind of it picks up essentially where Lord of the Realms leaves off, and then goes through the rest of Bud Selig's time as commissioner. And I think that's some really great insight into, Lords of the Realm is a lot about why there was a need for a union and the success of the union all the way up to the 94 strike. And The Game does a really good job of kind of the start of the downfall, and what they were up against and the conditions of the time, which were vastly different in a number of ways from what the players in the Lords of the Realm were going up against. Those are the 2 big ones for me.
Okay.
That are must reads. And there's Baseball's Power Shift by, this is so rude, I don't remember the author's name, it's behind me.
We can always look it up. We're a group of researchers, don't worry about it.
Baseball's Power Shift is great. Raceball is great for some of that talk I had about MLB helping spread imperialism and using that for their own financial benefit and exploiting a bunch of kids overseas. There's so many good writers out there these days covering labor stuff, which is great. Emma Bichellieri is great. RJ Anderson, Lindsay Adler has a great handle on these things. I don't mean to be mispronouncing people's names, but I'm talking so much that I need more water. There are so many people out there, which is great. Craig Calcaterra does a really good job. He just came out with a new book. I haven't read it yet, so I can't say if it's good or not. Sorry, Craig.
I've read it. It's great. Get it.
I'm meaning to. It's just I haven't done so yet.
It would lead us down a whole nother lane of discussion if you had, trust me. So now you have to.
I will.
And then, maybe we'll have Craig do this as well. If there are no more questions, and there doesn't seem to be, I want to thank you for joining us and answering so very many questions. And I really appreciate you dropping a little knowledge on us, because I keep saying this again, I don't know. So I'm grateful to follow you and to read you. Thanks to everyone for attending. This will be on YouTube in a few days. I'll share the link. The SABR Twitter account will also share the link. Follow Marc, read his work, educate yourselves on labor. And I'm so excited for opening day, y'all. So excited for me and for you. Thank you again for watching and have a great night.